You're listening to the Dibbly-Dobbly podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dibbly-Dobbly podcast. On today's episode of the podcast, we review the ODI series between Australia and Zimbabwe. It's the Dibbly-Dobbly podcast, and let's get started. Let's have a look at the series results from this ODI series between Australia and Zimbabwe. All three ODIs were played at the Riverway Stadium. The first ODI, Australia won by 5 wickets. Cameron Green was named player of the match. The second ODI, Australia won by 8 wickets. Mitchell Starc was named player of the match. And the third and final ODI, Zimbabwe won by 3 wickets. Ryan Buell was named player of the match. Australia won the series 2-1, and Adam Zampa was named player of the series. Let's have a look at Australia's performance with both bat and ball in this ODI series against Zimbabwe and talk about their performance in this ODI series overall. Where do you start for Australia in terms of describing how they went in this ODI series? I thought it was a bit of a mixed bag of results for them in this ODI series, Australia. They won the series in the end, which was expected, and they did that quite comfortably after the first 2 games, obviously, winning those games quite convincingly. Obviously, they were expected to win this series 3-0, but unfortunately in the last game they had a poor batting display, a poor batting performance, batting collapse, getting bowled out for 141 prevented them in winning this series 3-0, which was expected from most people before this series started. So Australia will be disappointed in batting so poorly in the last game and not being able to finish off the series strongly and win the series 3-0. So they'll be disappointed about that, but that happens in cricket. And, it was a good win from Zimbabwe. They deserve that. And I think that's what we want to see in cricket, is that we want to see the lower-ranked countries do well against the top-ranked countries and be able to win against them and be competitive. And Zimbabwe deserve their victory, hands down. And we shouldn't take anything away from Zimbabwe there. And Australia will be disappointed in the way they went about things with the bat in that last game. But they did well with the ball in the last game as well. And they were able to try and defend 141, take the wickets and put Zimbabwe under pressure. But in the end, it wasn't enough. And they lost that last game. But they still won the series 2-1. So as I say, it was a bit of a mixed bag of performances throughout the whole series. For Australia, but overall they'll be happy to win the series, and that's the important thing. But they will learn a lot from this ODI series against Zimbabwe, heading into the next ODI series of the Australian summer, which will be against the Trans-Tasman rivals in New Zealand. So that's going to be a very interesting series. Always is between Australia and New Zealand, especially any series they play in cricket. It's always interesting. So they will learn a lot from this series against Zimbabwe and hopefully get better against New Zealand as they work towards that 50-over World Cup next year in India. But let's talk about the batting and bowling performances. We'll start with the batsmen and their performance in this series against Zimbabwe. David Warner was the leading run scorer, 164 runs for him in the series. Smith, 96 runs. Maxwell, 51. Carey, 40. Stoinis, 22. Finch, 21. Green, 3. And Mitchell Marsh, 2. That's how the Australian batsmen went about things with the bat in this ODI series against Zimbabwe. Australia's batting was pretty dominant in the first 2 games, chasing low totals of 296 after Zimbabwe batted first. There were pretty easy run chases, you have to say, for Australia. Pretty straightforward. You expected them to chase down the runs, and they did. But in the last game, as we talked about a bit earlier, it was their worst batting performance in the series. Bowled out for 141 after 2 dominant displays in the first 2 games. Batting first for the first time in the series, trying to set a target for Zimbabwe. It was a perfect opportunity for Australia to try and get a big total and try to get some game time into some of the batsmen, because the likes of, Cameron Green, for example, didn't really bat much in the series. So to try and get those players some more game time with the bat. Unfortunately, that didn't quite work out. They got bowled out for 141. Now, we got to remember that the pitches in Townsville weren't as fast. They didn't quite have much pace in them. They were slow. Pretty much the pitch had a bit of movement in it as well for the bowlers. There was something there for the fast bowlers and the spinners. There was a bit of seam and swing and turn at times. So it was very difficult for batsmen to try and force the pace and try and really force the issue and be aggressive throughout this whole entire series. But in the last game for Australia, it just fell apart. There was ill discipline with the batting. There was poor shot selection. Batsmen made errors, didn't back up partnerships at all. The only one who batted well was David Warner. It looked like he batted on a different pitch compared to his contemporaries in the other Australian batsmen who struggled. And he made a very good 94. And without that innings from David Warner, Australia wouldn't have got to 141. They would have been bowled out for a lot less, probably 96, just like Zimbabwe were bowled out in game number 2. So it was a poor performance from Australia, and that is a concern for Australia, these batting collapses. We've seen these batting collapses happen in all Australian teams, whether it be test matches or ODIs or T20s. Australia always find a way to get a batting collapse, and that is a concern. That's something that Australia have to rectify and have to really work on, especially when you're going towards a T20 World Cup next year in India on difficult surfaces where it will keep low, it will turn, reverse swing will come into the game. Australia will have to contend with all that. And all the Australian batsmen will have to be better than they were in this third game of the series against Zimbabwe. Because if we have to be brutally honest, it was absolutely a poor performance. And it wasn't good enough, and not good enough by Australian standards. And certainly the batting group will certainly talk about that and say, this is not good enough. We have to be better going forward. And with the series, with the ODI series coming up against New Zealand, they would not like a repeat of what happened in the third game against Zimbabwe, because if that happens, then we've got some major problems. And for Australia, it is a concern with these batting collapses. They need to resolve them pretty quickly. So apart from the first 2 games, there were pretty good batting performances from Australia. Straightforward run chase, as I mentioned, but the last game, an opportunity to win the series 3-0. Many people expected Australia to do that. Unfortunately, they got out for 141, and that was the end of that. But they still won the series 2-1, and the batting group did do some good things in this series, especially in the first 2 games, not so much in the last game. Now, there's 3 players from the batting in this series for Australia that I've picked out that are under some sort of pressure heading into the ODI series against New Zealand, which is the next series for Australia. And that's Aaron Finch, Marcus Stoinis and Alex Carey. All of them did not do well in this series. They missed out on their opportunities. So let's talk about them quickly. Aaron Finch, we all know what's happening there. He's in a form slump. And there's pressure on Aaron Finch. He needs to score runs against New Zealand. Otherwise, that could be his last ODI series that he plays. I know the selectors have said publicly, George Bailey, we've backed him, we've support him, the players support him, we support him as selectors to be the captain and to open the batting for Australia. But there comes a point in time where the patience wears thin. And it does collapse. And for Aaron Finch, he is hanging by a thread. He needs to score some runs against New Zealand. If he doesn't, then we got to ask ourselves the questions. If he wasn't captain, and he was based on his performances not as captain, then he will be left out of the team straight away. That's just a straightforward decision. It's just common sense in cricket. When someone's struggling, they haven't done well for a long time, you change it up and you bring someone else in. Seeing that he is captain, Australia don't want to drop him. It's sort of like an Owen Morgan type situation where, okay, he's struggling with the bat, but we want him for the captaincy. And we don't want to change leaders going into a World Cup next year in India, especially with a one-day team. And you don't want to change a leader because it interrupts the cohesion of the team. But he needs to score some runs against New Zealand, Aaron Finch. Otherwise, he's under pressure. So he's one under pressure batsman that needs to score runs against New Zealand. The second one is Marcus Stoinis. He scored 22 runs in this series, an average of 11. Now, that's just not good enough. he is under pressure, Marcus Stoinis. And the thing with Marcus Stoinis is he hasn't made most of his opportunities when selected for Australia. I remember when he burst onto the scene and he got that century in Auckland during that one-day series in 2017, where he scored 140-odd not out and nearly got Australia over the line. And unfortunately, Australia didn't win that match in the end, obviously. But he batted well. We've seen what he can do in the Big Bash. We've seen what he can do. He's got a lot of ability. He's got a lot of power and strength. He can hit the ball a long way. But he's just inconsistent. And with Cameron Green in the side, as that other all-rounder, if it comes down to either Stoinis or Green, because you can't play Marcus Stoinis or Cameron Green in the same side. The team that Australia selected in this series is quite all-rounder heavy. That's the reason for that is because there's no Pat Cummins. As soon as Pat Cummins comes back into the side, he will take his rightful place, as deserved. Then you've got to choose between Cameron Green or Stoinis to be that all-rounder. And at the moment, I'm going with Cameron Green, to be honest. That's my opinion. That's my opinion there, because I think Cameron Green has a lot more to offer than Marcus Stoinis. He's capable with the bat, Cameron Green. He can take wickets. He can bowl quick. He's got extra bounce because of his height. Whereas Marcus Stoinis is not scoring runs. He's taken the odd wicket, but really, he should be scoring runs. He's more of a batting all-rounder than a bowler. And he's not doing both in terms of contributing. So he's under pressure. And he needs to take the opportunities given to him in the series against New Zealand to really make sure that he's in this side. Because he's a very good player. We know what he can do, but he's not doing it consistently for Australia. And the last one who's under pressure is Alex Carey. Now, Alex Carey made 40 runs in this series at average of 20. He's batted at number 4 in this series. Now, I understand Australia are trying different things, trying different combinations, different batting orders, different personnel. Alex Carey has batted up the order for South Australia. He's opened the batting for them. He's also opened the batting for Australia when David Warner was out of the side in 2018 in that period. Which I think he's batting too high in this series at number 4. We saw in the last game he got out cheaply. Now, Alex Carey is a finisher. He likes to finish the innings off. Whereas you send him up the order early on, where the team's in trouble, like Australia were in the first game, then he's just going to struggle. And he did. So for him, he needs to take the opportunities in the series against New Zealand. Otherwise, Josh English could be in the side, because he's in the side at the moment, in the squad, replacing Mitchell Marsh, obviously. So he could be the keeper as well. So if Alex Carey doesn't do well, then he could take his place, Josh Inglis, in the side. So I think Carey needs to be shifted down the order. I know they want Glenn Maxwell at number 7 to be that finisher type batsman, but I think Alex Carey's just batting too high at the moment. But we shall see what happens in the series against New Zealand. But those are the 3 batsmen that I feel like are under pressure heading into the next series against New Zealand, and pretty much had a very quiet series against Zimbabwe with the bat. The other batsmen like Warner, Smith, they did quite well. They had an okay series. Maxwell had an okay series. Cameron Green only batted once, and Mitchell Marsh only batted once, and then he had to go because of injury. So the rest of the batting group did okay. Overall, it was a mixed batting performance from Australia in this ODI series against Zimbabwe. Let's have a look at the Australian bowlers and their performance in this ODI series against Zimbabwe. Cameron Green was the leading wicket taker, along with Adam Zampa. They both took 8 wickets each for Australia. Mitchell Starc took 5, Hazelwood 4, Ashton Agar 2, and a wicket each for Stoinis and Mitchell Marsh. That's how the Australian bowlers went about things in this ODI series against Zimbabwe. Australia's bowling throughout this series was good. It was consistent. It was quality as always, with Hazelwood, Starc in particular. And we saw the emergence of Cameron Green, and obviously Adam Zampa coming back to the side has really made a difference to Australia in this series against Zimbabwe. The bowling for Australia was pretty good. They bowled Zimbabwe out for 296 in the first 2 games. It was a very good effort. It was very clinical. All the bowlers did their role and took wickets. The last game where Australia had the batting collapse and were bowled out for 141 was a good effort to try and defend that. In the end, it wasn't enough. Zimbabwe were able to get the runs and get the job done. I thought Josh Hazlewood bowled well in this entire series, especially in the last game. He bowled well, taking 3 for 30. He's a quality bowler, Josh, and he always is. He's got 100 ODI wickets now. He took that in game 3. Without Pat Cummins in the side, he's really stepped up as that main bowler for Australia. Mitchell Starc bowled well in the series, took 5 wickets. Game number 2 was his best game of the series, 3 for 24. He's the fastest to 200 ODI wickets. He took that in game 3. That's a proud achievement from Mitchell Starc. Obviously, he cops a lot of flack, Mitchell Starc, over the years because of his inconsistencies in that. But when he gets it right, he's a good bowler. And Australia saw that in this series, that he took wickets up front. Especially in the last game, he took some late wickets to try and win the game for Australia. So he's a very valuable asset for Australia in this bowling attack. Adam Zampa, he had a good series, 8 wickets. He was named player of the series as well. Was sorely missed by Australia in Sri Lanka, missing out due to family reasons on that tour. He makes this Australian attack much stronger with him in the side as the main spinner. And he gives that extra option to Aaron Finch in the bowling attack. Cameron Green, I mentioned him earlier. We really saw him improve as a bowler in this series. He's got so much to offer, Cameron Green, so much potential. I like him as a cricketer. I think he's going to be a good player. You can see that. He's got a high ceiling. He came into the side to replace Pat Cummins as that main strike bowler. Obviously, Pat Cummins being rested for the ODI series against Zimbabwe and New Zealand. But Cameron Green's really stepped up. He took a 5-wicket haul in this series, his first ever in international cricket, his first in ODI cricket. I think he's going to have a good series against New Zealand. He just adds so much to this side, and I think when Pat Cummins does come back into the side, he could replace Marcus Stoinis as that all-rounder, because it's probably going to be between him, Mitchell Marsh, to be that all-rounder in Australia's side, and I would go with Cameron Green, I think. So he's got a lot to offer. Just to finish off about the Australian bowling, before we talk about Zimbabwe's performance with both bat and ball in this series, Australia did the basics well with the ball in this whole entire series. They bowled dot balls, they executed their plans and skills with the ball, bowled a consistent line length, and challenged the Zimbabwean batsmen. So overall, it was a good bowling performance from Australia in this ODI series against Zimbabwe. And overall, it was a mixed performance from Australia throughout this whole ODI series against against Zimbabwe, I should say. They did well in the first 2 games, Australia, to win those games and win the series. The last game is where it fell away. They were bowled out for 141, poor batting collapse, and that prevented them to win the series 3-0. So I think a lot of people will criticise them for not winning this series 3-0. But at the end of the day, it was a historical victory for Zimbabwe, and you just have to say, well played to Zimbabwe. They deserve that victory. They were better on the day. For Australia, they will learn a lot from this series against Zimbabwe. There's a lot of questions to be answered, and some of them don't have any answers to them. Those questions don't have any answers to them, I should say. But hopefully those questions will be answered in the series against New Zealand, that ODI series, which is starting very shortly. But Australia will learn a lot from this series. They want to get better. They want to improve. They want to build a brand of cricket that they feel like is going to win the 50-over World Cup next year in India. So for Australia, overall, it was an okay performance in this series. Can they get better? They can. And hopefully in the series against New Zealand, they can win that series and continue their preparations for that 50-over World Cup next year in India. Let's have a look at Zimbabwe's performance with both bat and ball in this ODI series against Australia and talk about their performance in this ODI series overall. Now, this ODI series for Zimbabwe against Australia was all about learning and developing as a team. It was all about trying to learn as much as they can, and it was a great opportunity for Zimbabwe to play Australia in Australia for the first time since 2003-04, during that summer when they came to Australia for their last visit, before this one in 2022. So it was a perfect opportunity for all of these players to experience what it's like playing against Australia and playing in Australia as well and playing against the Australian team. Before the series, everyone predicted that it was probably going to be a 3-0 series win to Australia. And given how both teams are quite far apart in terms of where they're at as a cricket team at the moment. Obviously, Australia, one of the best teams in the world. Zimbabwe, down at the bottom of the pack in world cricket. But for them to come out in the last game and to win the last game of the series just showed that this team has got tremendous spirit and belief that, we can get better and we can improve as a team going forward. And for them winning the last game of this series, they will remember this win for a very long time. It's quite a very historical win for Zimbabwe for all the right reasons. Number one, it's their first ever win against Australia in one-day cricket. It's their third ever ODI victory against Australia in their history. Obviously, the first one was back in 1983 during the Cricket World Cup. The second one came in that tri-series in Harare back in 2014. And obviously this one in 2022 in Townsville. So, for Zimbabwe, this win is very important for them as a team, giving them that belief that, we can be competitive and we can cause an upset. Despite being the underdogs, we can cause an upset and we can have the belief that we can match it and we can compete against some of the world's best teams in the world. Take the India game, for example. They only lost that last game of that India series by 13 runs. They nearly won against India. And now to win against Australia has just shown that they are improving and they are getting better. And I think this victory is good for the game of cricket. It's good for the sport going forward in terms of developing lower-ranked countries and nations like Zimbabwe, Afghanistan and Ireland, and the other countries like the Netherlands and Scotland. It's good for them to try and develop, get better, and improve on a day-to-day basis. And for Zimbabwe, it was good to see them tour Australia again, and to have success in the last game. They'll be pretty happy, and they'll be looking back on this and saying, it was great to be a part of this team when we won in Australia in 2022. And you can't take that away from the Zimbabwean team. In the end, they deserved to win that last game of the series. They bowled well. They bowled Australia out for 141. They batted well, and we'll talk about the batsmen and their performance in the series in just a moment. But it was a very good batting display from them to try and get the runs and get over the line. And they were able to get the job done and do it. So let's talk about the batting and bowling performances. But first of all, let's talk about the batsmen and how they went about things in this series. So the leading run scorer was Maramundi with 84 runs, Chaveka 78, Mahir 74, Mayonga 34, Raza 30, Williams 29, Catania 19, and Kaya 19. That's how the Zimbabwean batsmen performed throughout this whole series against Australia. And it was a bit of a mixed bag for Zimbabwe. Their batting was inconsistent throughout the whole series. Now, we know it was always going to be a challenge for the Zimbabwean batsmen up against the quality Australian bowlers. They were always going to be challenged and tested. But I thought it was a good opportunity for them to learn how to bat against some of the best bowlers in the world, like Stark, Hazelwood. Obviously, Pat Cummins didn't play, but it would have been nice if Pat Cummins did play. And trying to face them and trying to work out plans and strategies on how to score runs against those quality bowlers. Zimbabwe, their totals in this inning, in this whole entire series weren't great. The first game, they got bowled out for 200, batting first, and that was not going to be enough, obviously, for Australia to be troubled by. And Australia chased down the runs with ease to win by 5 wickets. The second game, they made 96 all out, and that was a bit of a setback. And whenever you get bowled out for a low score under 100, it's always demoralising. It crushes the morale of the team. And, to get bowled out for 96, it's quite demoralising. It does wreck the morale and the spirit within the team and the belief that, okay, it may happen again. And in the last game, the only difference was that they were chasing. And this Zimbabwean team like to chase. They don't like to bat first. They like to bowl first. And they won the toss in the last game. They bowled first. They bowled Australia out for 141. And they were able to get the target of 142 runs to win. In the end, they finished on 7 for 142, chased down 141 and won the game, as we all know. So the first two games were poor with the bat, but the last game showed that improvement and showed the areas of what they want to try and improve at with their batting. And I noticed quite a lot from the Zimbabwean batsmen in the last game is that they were trying different things. And Dave Horton, the Zimbabwean coach, said, I want to try and get this team, especially the batsmen, playing with positive intent and being aggressive. And we saw that in this last game of the series. They were trying different things that they didn't do in the first two games, like charging down the pitch to the fast bowlers. So, obviously, we all know that tactic from batsmen where they advance down the wicket to spinners, but to fast bowlers, they do the same, using their feet, trying to upset their line and length. And that's what the Zimbabwean batsmen did to Australia's bowlers in this last game. And that's sort of the strategy that they want to employ with their batting in this team, is to be a bit more aggressive and positive. Now, often that is a bit daunting whenever you do that up against quality bowlers like Hazelwood and Stark, charging down the pitch to them. But some of the batsmen did that, and some of them were successful in this last game, and it paid off. So that's a good sign from their batting. And as I said, this last game was their best batting performance. You know, they really batted within themselves, Zimbabwe. And you could see that they were determined. They weren't going to throw it away. They knew that we had to bat sensibly. Obviously, they were going to try and sort of crawl their way to the total. Obviously, 141 is quite easy for other teams to chase down in world cricket. If it was Australia chasing in this game, obviously, as we've seen in the previous two games, they would have made mincemeat of the total. But for Zimbabwe, it felt like they were chasing 200 rather than 141. And they crawled their way to the total and they were able to get the job done. You know, they did the basics well. They had a few shaky moments in the innings. You know, they were 5 for 77 at one stage, inside 18.3 overs. But they made it harder for themselves at times by losing wickets. But it was Chaveka, the captain, who stood up in that last game. And he batted quite well in this series. You know, he made 78 runs, average of 39. So he had a pretty good series in terms of his point of view and where he wanted to do in this series. But I thought in the last game, he took that responsibility as the captain, the anchor role sort of person to get the team over the line, and that's what he did. And that was very impressive to see that from him. And to see Zimbabwe just realizing that we need to do that now. And him realizing that I'm the captain, I'm the senior player, I need to bat smart here. And that is, I'm going to hold up my end of the bargain, which is I'm going to be here until the end, and I need other players to support me in the run chase. And that's what they did. And they supported the captain, and he was able to get the team over the line with a very good innings, a very good captain's knock. And that's what you want to see from your batsmen, being able to read situations and be smart about it. And Zimbabwe did that. They took their time. They weren't over-aggressive, but they were trying to be aggressive. But they took their time. They didn't throw it away. There wasn't a big batting collapse. Yes, they did lose wickets, but they didn't throw it away, and they kept going, and they kept crawling their way to the total, to the target, and in the end, they got there. So Zimbabwe's batting was inconsistent throughout the series, but in the last game, I did see some signs of improvement, and I can see what they want to try and do as a batting side is that they want to play a bit more aggressively, and they have their game plan, and they want to stick to that game plan and try and make it work, and I hope they do. So, yeah, just to finish up about the Zimbabwean batting, it was a very good performance in the last game. The first two games, they will learn a lot from those first two experiences in the first two games, obviously. Where do they go wrong? How can we get better? But in the last game, they'll take tremendous confidence going forward, knowing that if we bat this way, we can have success, and especially against the top-ranked teams, like we saw with the run chase, chasing down 141 against Australia, is a pretty good effort, if you ask me. Now, before we move on about the Zimbabwean batting, before we talk about the bowlers quickly, let's talk about Sekinder Raza. He was the in-form batsman for Zimbabwe headed into this series. Unfortunately, he didn't have a great series. He got out 3 times to the short ball, and Australia worked that out pretty quickly after game 1. Okay, bowl short, he's going to hook it, and he's going to get caught at fine leg, which he did on 2 previous occasions. So 3 times he got out to the short ball. He had a good series against Bangladesh and India, scoring centuries, but in this series against Australia, he was quite the disappointing batsman for Zimbabwe, because a lot of people had expectations that he would do well. So for him, he will learn a lot from this series, but we know how good of a player he can be, Sukhinder Raza. So I thought he had a pretty poor series with the bat, but the rest of the Zimbabwean batsmen found it tough at times throughout the series, but they were able to come together in the last game and put together a good batting performance to get the team over the line. So overall, it was an inconsistent batting performance at times from Zimbabwe throughout the series, but I think the batsmen should be proud of their efforts, especially in the final game of the series, where Zimbabwe got a historical win against Australia. Let's have a look at the Zimbabwean bowlers and their performance in this ODI series against Australia. Ryan Buell was the leading wicket taker for Zimbabwe. He took 8 wickets for the series. Navara took 4 wickets. Evans, 2. Nietzsche, Williams and Raza all took a wicket each for Zimbabwe throughout this series against Australia. So that's how the Zimbabwean bowlers performed against Australia in this series overall. Just like their batting, Zimbabwe, their bowling was inconsistent at times as well. The first 2 games, their bowling was not good. Defending scores of 296 in the first 2 games was always going to be difficult. And that always puts pressure on a bowling side. When you're when you're defending a low target, I should say, with the ball, there's no room for error. You've got to do the basics right, build dot balls, bowl dot balls, build pressure on the batsman that way. Take wickets at regular intervals if you can. Try and execute your plans and skills with the ball. And for Zimbabwe, they didn't quite do that in the first 2 games. In the last game, where they bowled Australia out for 141, that was their best bowling performance in this whole series, because they did the things that you need to do well and have success with the ball. And that's pretty much what I said earlier. Do the basics well with the ball. And in the last game, they did that. They bowled dot balls. They built pressure on the Australian batsmen. Because Australia were losing wickets, they kept bowling dot balls, building that pressure. Then an Australian batsman got out. They executed their plans and skills with the ball. They bowled consistent lines and lengths, challenging the Australian batsman every ball. And the surfaces and the pitches throughout this whole entire ODI series against Australia and Zimbabwe, the pitch did offer a bit. They played on the same pitch 3 times in a row in this series. And the pitch did offer a bit early in the morning, especially in the first innings. Obviously, these games weren't day-night games. They were day matches. And they were starting very early in the morning, around about 9 o'clock in the morning. The ball nipped around a bit, swung, seamed, moved around. It was challenging for batsmen. And the Zimbabwean bowlers were able to exploit that and challenge the Australian batsmen in the last game, and they were able to get success and bowl them out for 141. So they did the basics well there, Zimbabwe. So that was their best bowling performance throughout this whole entire series. The quality of bowling attacks is quite significant in terms of the gap between the 2 bowlers, bowling attacks. Australia's bowlers, Stark, Hazelwood, you got Sampa, you got Cameron Green, are very advanced in terms of their skill set compared to the Zimbabwean bowlers like Buell, Navara, Evans, Nietzsche, Williams and Raza, who are trying to get better and trying to improve, but at the same time, the quality and the skill set is quite significant between the 2 bowling attacks. But they were able to bowl within themselves and get the job done with the ball. And especially Ryan Buell, he took 5 wickets for 10 in that last game. Turned the match on its head, really, because he broke that partnership of Warner and Maxwell. And that partnership looked like getting Australia back on track. And Australia were looking like getting 200 with that partnership. But once he got Glenn Maxwell out for 19, caught and bowled, it was a brilliant move from Cheveka to bring him into the attack. And he got the job done and he got the breakthrough. And that pretty much swung the match in Zimbabwe's favour, I should say. from that moment on, I should say. And they were able to get the job done and bowl Australia out for 141. So for Zimbabwe, their bowlers were inconsistent at times in the series, but in the last game, they were able to get it together and bowl well. They will learn a lot from this series, the Zimbabwean bowlers, on how to go about bowling to some of the best batsmen in the world, trying to work out how to get particular batsmen out, what are their strengths and weaknesses. They've got some good bowlers, Navara, for example. In game number 2, he bowled well, picking up those 2 early wickets in the run chase, which were the only 2 wickets to fall during the run chase for Australia in game number 2. He bowled well in that match and took 2 wickets. Buell bowled well in the last game. So they've got bowlers who can take wickets, and they've got some skills as well. It's just about trying to get better and just nailing the basics all the time and being consistent. If they can do that, then they can have success and they can take plenty more wickets in the future. So overall, their bowling performance in this series was inconsistent at times, but they showed some signs of promise, and they showed some signs of getting wickets and putting the opposition under pressure, which they definitely did in the last game to Australia when they bowled them out for 141. So overall, it was an inconsistent bowling performance from Zimbabwe throughout the entire series. Overall, it was an inconsistent series as a team for Zimbabwe overall in this series. But they were able to win the last game to finish off the series 2-1, which was a very historical victory for them. And that win would give them tremendous confidence going forward as a one-day team. But they would have learnt a lot from this ODI series. Despite losing the series 2-1, they should be proud of winning the last game. They deserve it. It's quite historical, and everyone in Zimbabwe will be celebrating this historical victory. For Zimbabwe, I should say, they did show some signs of improvement, and they got better towards the end of the series. They stumbled at times throughout the series, but that happens. You just got to get back up again and go again in cricket, because there's got to be a lot of failures. But you learn from your failures and you will succeed. And Zimbabwe definitely did that in this last game of the series, where they were able to win the game. So for Zimbabwe, they would learn a lot from this series, as I mentioned. Hopefully they'll get better and improve as a one-day team going forward. We wish them all the best, and hopefully we see them back in Australia again for another ODI series or a T20 series, even more, a test series in the near future as well. Hopefully we see them back in Australia in the near future. But congratulations to Zimbabwe on winning that last game. Hopefully they can learn from that and develop and be a very good competitive cricket team. Congratulations to Australia on winning the ODI Series 2-1. They will be disappointed not to win the series 3-0 after a poor batting performance in Game 3, which saw Zimbabwe claim victory by 3 wickets. But Australia will look at the areas to improve on headed into the ODI series against New Zealand. Zimbabwe will be disappointed with their performance in this ODI series against Australia, but they will be delighted to win the final game and claim a historic win in Australia. This victory will give them lots of confidence going forward as a one-day team. Zimbabwe will learn a lot from this series against Australia and hopefully apply the lessons learnt to future games and series. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get the latest episodes of the podcast, and like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Until next time, keep safe and bye for now.